Well, hey, I want to wish you dads a happy Father's Day. I was thinking this week a little bit about, the way kids relate to their dads and the way that changes over time. In their childhood, dad's like that protecting giant. He seems perfect and invincible. And of course, then adolescence hits and that all begins to change, Kids begin to notice his flaws and his weaknesses and his sins. They may question his judgment and even challenge his ideas. And for a variety of reasons, some people never seem to get beyond that phase, but those who do begin to relate to their dads in a more mature, a balanced way, with a new respect for him as a real person, kind of warts and all, if you know what I mean. I was thinking about it. In a way, you see those same kinds of phases or different ways of relating in the way that people think about the heroes of faith. We've been talking about heroes of faith from Hebrews chapter 11. And some people think of those Old Testament believers that we've been talking about as spiritual giants. Do you ever think of them that way? Like superheroes, almost like fictional characters. And so people that do that place them in a completely different category from us. They may even pray to them as saints. Some people do that, but that's something God never intended. But then other people go to the other extreme, right? It's like that adolescent. Others have nothing but doubts and questions and criticism. They can't believe that Noah actually survived a universal flood, or they can't believe that Moses led the people through the Red Sea on dry land. So some people reject the biblical heroes and their God. But today, as we're finishing off our study of Hebrews 11 today, and as we do, we're considering a passage that gives us a more mature, balanced perspective. We're looking at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 through 40. So I encourage you to take your Bible and turn there with me. And follow along as I talk. If you don't have one, there's one there underneath the chair in front of you. And what I see in this passage is that Hebrews 11, 32 through 40 gives us a 4-part description of heroes of faith. And the whole idea is to help us follow in their footsteps. Now, thus far, the chapter has been like a collage. It doesn't go into a lot of depth on any one person, but it just gives us picture after picture of all of these different individuals. But when we get to this last paragraph, it's like it just all kind of blurs together. He lists individuals, he talks about things that have happened in their lives, and it all sort of intermingles so that you walk away with just these 4 points that stand out. And the first one is this. How do we describe those heroes? It's first that they're imperfect people. With it being Father's Day, some of my earliest memories of my dad related to his work. He was in construction. And at one point, I remember one year he even drove heavy equipment. And as a kid growing up, it's mesmerizing to see those huge machines, level a piece of land. And in a way, I think that's what Hebrews 11:32 does. It has that same kind of effect on the landscape of biblical heroes. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Take a look at Hebrews 11, verse 32. The author says, "What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel, and the prophets." Now that's an interesting list. Some of these men stand out as giants in our understanding. Right, spiritual giants, but others really don't. David and Samuel are huge, but Gideon was a coward. Judges chapter 6 tells us how after God spoke to him, Gideon kept wanting additional confirmation. Do you remember that story? The story of the fleece? How Gideon put out the fleece and said, "Well, God, if what you're saying is true, let the fleece be wet and everything around it dry." And then that wasn't enough. God, if what you say is true, let everything else be wet and the fleece dry, right? He was just, there was this cowardly sense. He wanted all of these signs and extra confirmation. And then there's Barak. Now, Barak comes from Judges chapter 4, And he is a man that he refused to go to battle without the prophetess Deborah. And so there's this sense of fear. He didn't want to go unless this female prophetess went with him. In fact, even in Barak's victory in battle that God gave him, ultimately it wasn't through him. The enemy commander was killed by a woman. The commander had fled and wound up in her tent, and the story is that she drove a tent peg through his temple. Right? The book of Judges. And then another one of the judges, Samson. Samson, of course, was physically powerful. Amazing story in Judges 13 through 16. But he was immoral. He was out of control. He was reckless. And then there's Jephthah. Jephthah's another judge from Judges chapter 11. And he was rash. I mean, he made this vow on the battlefield that he would sacrifice whatever came out of the door of his house. And he returns home, and it's his daughter who comes out. And you think, boy, these are giants? I mean, these people are kind of scary. How could these men even be grouped together with David and Samuel? But then you stop and think about David and Samuel. I mean, the scripture tells us that King David was a man after God's own heart. He wrote many of the Psalms. But he's also the guy who committed adultery with a woman named Bathsheba. And then had her faithful husband sent into unnecessary danger on the battlefield where he died. I mean, that's King David. First, we find his story in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st Chronicles. They all talk about David. And then even Samuel himself. Samuel was a judge and a prophet. He was the one who anointed David as king. But there's a brief mention before God anoints Saul and David as kings, that Samuel was trying to appoint his own sons as judges in his place, even though his sons were ungodly. So those first 4 judges that are listed here really just serve to kind of highlight the imperfections, the faults, the weaknesses of even David and Samuel, and then it talks about the prophets in general. So in a sense, there's really no such thing as a hero. Not in the sense of someone being perfect, not when we look at those Old Testament characters. The Bible makes it clear that these men and every other person we've talked about in this series were sinful. Right? They were imperfect people. They were not saints in the way that we often think of that term. They're not up on some pedestal. Right? The Bible kind of plows down those exalted views. The heroes of faith all stand on level ground with us. They're normal people. And they're not any different than you or I. If we miss that, then we've kind of missed the whole point of this series. Because the whole reason the author wrote this chapter was to encourage people who were struggling to say, look, everybody else throughout history struggled with the same things you're facing. Now, the bottom line of this is all of us need God's forgiveness. We're sinful people. Have you done that? Have you sought God's forgiveness? Have you ever confessed your sin and asked God to forgive you, to save you? So we start with this point. Imperfect people. But they were, secondly, empowered by God. Of course, one of the popular Father's Day gifts, right after the tie, the traditional tie, is power tools. What dad doesn't like power tools? And of course, the real power isn't in the tool, right? No tool does the work on its own. You have to plug it in. You have to pull the trigger. You have to guide it along. And in a way, that's sort of what we see happening with these heroes of faith. It's not their power. It's not their wisdom or their strength. It's all of God. And sometimes they cooperate with him. Sometimes He works even in spite of their foolishness. So maybe it's better to say, sometimes not even empowered by God, but say employed by God or used by God. Now, we see this all come out in verses 33 down through the beginning of verse 35. And we'll take this just phrase by phrase. Take a look at Hebrews 11:33 there. It begins and says, who through faith conquered kingdoms. Now, that could refer to the time when Joshua led Israel in conquering the land. We talked about that last week, about them conquering the city of Jericho. Remember, God had them go around the city once a day for 6 days, and on the seventh day, they went around the city 7 times, and they shouted, blew trumpets, and the walls fell down. Right? Well, that victory was entirely God's doing. They didn't have any great strength or power to bring that about. That was purely God's. Now, after that, the other battles that Israel faced, they actually had to fight. They didn't all work out that way. But that initial victory over Jericho made the point to them that God was the one who was going to do it. It was going to be by his power. They conquered kingdoms empowered by God. Now, next, looking back at verse 33, it speaks of those who enforced justice. And that could be said of all of the judges, or later on the kings of Israel in the Old Testament, who had that responsibility. They were responsible to enforce justice. But maybe the greatest example of that was King Solomon. Remember the story of Solomon? Solomon had, God gave Solomon the opportunity to ask for anything that he would want, and Solomon asked for wisdom. Now, he didn't always make right choices. Even though Solomon knew what the right choice was, he still made some wrong choices, some sinful, foolish choices, but he did have the ability to bring about justice. And the story that's told, right after he prays this prayer to God for wisdom, is when 2 women come with one baby and they both want the same child, right? Remember the story? They were staying together, and one of the babies died, and then both moms were claiming that the remaining baby that was alive was hers. You remember what Solomon did? He asked for a sword. He said he was going to divide the baby and give each half. And then the woman who spoke up and said, no, don't do that, give it to her, he knew that was the true mother. And so we see these examples like that. God blessed Solomon with supernatural wisdom, and he enforced justice. Then looking back at verse 33, it speaks of those who obtained promises. Now again, we saw previously in talking about Abraham, how Abraham saw God's promise fulfilled when God allowed Abraham and Sarah to conceive and gave them their son Isaac, even in their old age. But again, this expression, obtained promises, that could apply to other believers as well who received specific promises from God. But again, receiving a promise, that's not something that we do in our own strength. It's God himself just receiving. The last phrase there in verse 33 speaks of someone who stopped the mouths of lions. Of course, the most obvious connection there that reminds us of is the prophet Daniel. Remember Daniel's story? He lived during the time of the Persians and the Persian Empire, and Daniel was faithful in praying to God, and so people who were opposed to Daniel had a law passed that no one could pray to anyone other than the king. And so they basically set Daniel up, found him praying, even though he was close to the king. The king has to follow the law. He has Daniel thrown into the lion's den. And so but it wasn't Daniel really who stopped the lions' mouths, right? That's the way it reads here. It was God's power at work. Daniel simply was on the receiving end of it. Verse 34, another phrase, it speaks of those who quenched the power of fire. That's probably a reference to Daniel's friends. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the names the Babylonians gave them, and they refused to bow down to a statue of King Nebuchadnezzar, and for that, they were cast into a fiery furnace. You remember that story? And God preserved their lives. Did they do anything to quench the fire? No, not a bit. It was completely outside of their control. It was entirely of God. Verse 34 then next speaks of those who escaped the edge of the sword. Again, this could refer to any number of Bible stories, but I think it brings to mind the story of David when he was fleeing from King Saul. His life was threatened, and God kept preserving him. The third phrase in verse 34, it says, "Were made strong out of weakness." Now again, we already talked about Samson. There's no better example of that than the end of Samson's life. Remember, his power had been taken away. His eyes had been gouged out. He was enslaved by the Philistines. And as they mocked him in their temple, Samson prayed for strength, and God enabled him to knock down the pillars of that temple and to kill the Philistines, the enemies of Israel. So you see God at work in these cases. This is all starting to blur together, isn't it? You see what I'm saying about this? The author just hits these all so quickly. It's just a blur, but you get this general sense of God at work. The next two phrases are even more general. It says, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. I mean, that could apply to any number of battles recorded in the Old Testament. And then the last example in verse 35, it says, women received back their dead by resurrection. Now that probably refers to miracles that were performed by the prophet Elijah and then his successor Elisha, because God used both of those prophets to raise up sons who had died. And they knew the mother, they knew the family, and at the mother's request, they raised these sons back to life. So all of these incredible deeds demonstrate the working of God's power. Right? These heroes of faith, it wasn't that they had any strength or might in and of themselves. It was that they trusted God in the midst of all these things. And so the challenge that I think it brings to us is to stop and look at our own lives and say, what part of my life, what circumstances, what trials, what difficulties are going on in which I need to trust in God's power? Right? What things are out of my control? Where do I need to trust God and to rest in His power? The next part of the description of true heroes of faith is that they're imperfect people, right, who are empowered by God, but thirdly, they endure opposition. It's a spectacular sight to see salmon swimming upstream. I don't know if you've ever seen that before. You can tell that God designed them for that. And in the same way, the life of faith requires us to swim against a steady current of opposition. At times it's strong, at times it's overt, other times it's subtle but tiring, wearisome. And so these next few verses, the middle of verse 35 down through verse 38, they list examples of opposition that believers have faced because of their faith. Look at what verse 35 says. It begins with that, talking about the women receiving back their dead by resurrection. And then it says, some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Now, we never see a story in the Bible that quite fits this description. So some scholars think that what the author had in mind was the experience of Jews at the hands of the Greeks during the Maccabean period. That was a few hundred years before the time of Christ, the time in between when the Old Testament was completed and when Christ came. People actually being tortured for their faith. Now, verse 36 then says, Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. Now that's something that we see in the lives of some of the Old Testament prophets, but it particularly lines up with the experience that the apostles had in following Christ. We read about it in the book of Acts. The apostles and other Christians in the first century faced that kind of treatment. Verse 37 says they were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. Now, when we look through the Bible for events like that, tradition tells us that the prophet Jeremiah was put to death by stoning. But in the book of Acts, we read of a man named Stephen who was killed in that way. Tradition tells us that the prophet Isaiah was sawn in two. And then Acts 12 tells us that the apostle James was killed with the sword. So here again, the author is just kind of blending all these things together. And it just has this effect on us, this impact of seeing what these people endured. And he finishes it off there at the end of verse 37. He says, they went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Now that reminds me of the experience of Elijah. Remember, Elijah accomplished this great victory as he was opposing King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. And they were worshiping the false god Baal. Remember, Elijah called them together with these false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And they had this kind of showdown between the gods. They set up their offering and he set up his. And they chanted and cut themselves and did all these things to try to get their God to cause their sacrifice to catch on fire. And it never happened. And Elijah has people pour water all over his, and then he prays, and then boom, it just catches on fire. It demonstrates the power of God. Well, after that incredible victory, then Jezebel starts pursuing Elijah, wanting to put him to death, and he winds up in the wilderness. And it fits with this description of his life experience, fits with the description we just read there. Now, that's so different from what we experience in believing, in having faith, right? The opposition that we face today in our culture tends to be a lot more subtle. It's more beguiling. We face temptation. We face disapproval or mocking. But of course, that could easily change. Now, I have to say here, the whole point of this is not to say that we scout or provoke opposition from people. Now, I think some people do provoke opposition. Some professing Christians are arrogant. They're argumentative. They're pushy. And that kind of behavior irritates people. That's not Christ-like. That's more like the behavior of the Pharisees. But I think Colossians chapter 4, verse 6 describes a Christ-like attitude. Here's what it says. It says, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Is that how you relate to people? First of all, do you speak the truth? I think that's what he's getting at here and talking about having our speech be seasoned with salt. It's the truth of the gospel as it flow out as you interact with people. But secondly, do you do it in a gracious way? Do you speak with love? And yet, even when we behave this way, when we relate to people like this, there will still be people who take offense, who oppose our faith. And so the bottom line of reading this incredible description here in Hebrews is we have to ask ourselves, am I willing to face opposition? As minimal as it seems to be in our culture here and now, am I willing to endure that? The last part of this description that I want to talk about today is there in verses 39 and 40, and it's waiting for perfection. I remember when I was growing up, my dad had a big pair of binoculars. At least they They seemed big to me at the time. And what kid isn't fascinated by looking off into the distance through binoculars? In a sense, the life of faith is kind of like that. It's looking out into the distance. Listen to what Hebrews 11:39 and 40 say here. It says, "And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect." So the heroes we've considered did see some of God's promises fulfilled, but it was generally more of a token or a foretaste or a preview of what God was doing, of what everything was leading toward. It wasn't the final fulfillment. And so as I read these verses here, this is what I picture. It's as if all the believers throughout history are in a race. But all the ones who have gone before us, they haven't crossed the finish line yet. They're right at the line waiting for all of us to get there so that we all cross the line together. Right? That's what happens. So what is this finish line? What is this expectation? What's in the distance? What are we waiting for? It's there at the end of verse 40. It says that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. That's what they're waiting for. They're waiting for perfection. Now, we've already said that we're all imperfect, right? That's true of all of these characters listed in Hebrews 11. It's true of us. And so perfection, think of it firstly, perfection is what we need in order to escape that sense of guilt, those feelings of conviction. I mean, don't you get tired of being tempted? Don't you get tired of falling into sin? Perfection is being free from that. What an incredible thing. Perfection is also what we need in order to enter into Christ's kingdom. And perfection is what we need in order to draw near to God, to be in his presence, to enjoy all the goodness of eternity with him. That's why everybody's looking for perfection. And that theme, that idea of perfection runs all throughout the book of Hebrews. This time, when it mentions it here in verse 40, that's the 10th time it's spoken of perfection in the first 11 chapters of Hebrews. And there's still 2 more references before you finish the book 2 chapters later. I mean, Hebrews is all about this idea of showing us where true perfection comes from. And one of the key verses that we talked about earlier this year, Hebrews 10:14, it said, "For by a single offering, he," that's Jesus, "has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified." So to sum up what we learned through Hebrews, it's that Jesus lived a perfect life. He is the true hero of faith. He was empowered by God. He endured opposition even to the point of death. And in his death, he bore the punishment we deserve for our imperfections, for our sins, so that when we believe, we can be forgiven. And plus, that his perfect righteousness can be credited to us. So what we see here, even in this verse, is this combination of ideas that in one sense, everyone who believes is already perfect in God's eyes because of what Christ has done. Because it's his perfection that when we believe, we become perfect in God's eyes. But at the same time, there's, in another sense, as it says there at the end of the verse, we are being sanctified. In other words, we're being made more holy, more perfect. We're growing spiritually. We're changing. We're learning to put aside sin. We're growing up. And yet, like all the other believers throughout history, as we read there in Hebrews 11, verse 40, we're all waiting. We're all looking off into the distance for that time when Christ will return. And when we'll be made like him, when we'll become perfect as he's perfect. Is that what you're waiting for? Do you look forward to that hope? So, this is what it means to be a hero of faith. It's imperfect people, empowered by God, enduring opposition and waiting for perfection. And the whole idea here, and I've said it several times throughout this series, is that these characters that are recorded in Scripture are not the only heroes of faith. Every one of us has an untold story, a story that's unfolding even today. And by God's grace, we can trust Him and make those choices to honor Him, to have that heroic faith like all the people we've studied over the past 3 months. So I encourage you today to think about what the next step is for you. Do you need to seek God's forgiveness? Is that where you're at? To acknowledge your sin and to rely on Christ's death as the sacrifice that makes it possible for us to be cleansed, to be forgiven. If you've never done that, I encourage you to take that step. Or is the next step for you, is there one of those circumstances in your life that's just overwhelming and you need to rely on God's power? I mean, one of the things we see about these heroes of faith, it's not like their whole life is all exciting. You know, it's not like some tremendous event happens every other day. Most of their life is probably pretty boring. It's not even recorded. You get somebody's whole life, and one day gets talked about. You know, when is that day for you? You never know. Right? It could still be ahead. Maybe there's something that's already happened in your life. What do you need to rely on God's power for? What trials? What difficulties? Or maybe today, maybe it's that reality of opposition. Maybe you need to come to the point that you accept that. That being a believer means encountering opposition. And we don't need to fight that. We need to accept it. Christ said, this is how it would be. Or maybe a good response today would be to keep reading Hebrews. Next week, we're going to continue on in Hebrews chapter 12. And we'll be in Hebrews 12 and 13. And I think the overarching theme of that last section of the book is good news for suffering believers. It's meant to be an encouragement to help us deal with the realities of life. So my prayer for us today is that we would honor God in our faith, that we would trust Him and rely upon Him.